Hamas has recently provided its formal response to the latest ceasefire proposal, a plan backed by the United States of America. In this response, the group has indicated a willingness, as an initial step, to free 10 living Israeli hostages. This gesture is being seen by some as a potential opening, a first move in what would undoubtedly be a complicated and protracted negotiation process. The international community, weary from months of intense conflict and numerous failed diplomatic efforts, is observing these developments with a mixture of cautious optimism and considerable skepticism. The specifics of this first phase, should it materialize, will be absolutely critical, as they will likely determine the atmosphere and viability of any subsequent discussions aimed at a more comprehensive agreement. The absolute cornerstone of Hamas's conditions, a point they have reiterated consistently, is the demand for a permanent and lasting ceasefire. For Hamas, this is not merely a tactical pause in the fighting, it is an insistence on a complete and verifiable cessation of all hostilities. Senior figures within the organization have made it abundantly clear that temporary truces are no longer acceptable. Their stated fear is that Israel would use any such pause to regroup its military forces and then resume its offensive operations, possibly with even greater intensity. Therefore, they are seeking an unambiguous and internationally guaranteed end to the war, a conflict that has now dragged on for many agonizing months, inflicting an almost unimaginable degree of suffering upon the civilian population in Gaza. Another non-negotiable demand put forward by Hamas is the complete and unconditional withdrawal of all Israeli military forces from every part of the Gaza Strip. This includes all territories that Israeli forces have entered and occupied since the commencement of their ground offensive. From Hamas's perspective, this withdrawal is a fundamental issue of sovereignty for the Palestinian people. They argue that it is an essential prerequisite for any chance of a return to some semblance of normal life for the inhabitants of Gaza. An ongoing Israeli military presence, they contend, would signify continued occupation and inevitably lead to further conflict, thereby rendering any ceasefire agreement ultimately meaningless and unsustainable in the long run. The third key pillar of Hamas's demands centers on securing robust guarantees for the consistent, substantial, and unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. This must be coupled, they insist, with the complete lifting of the stringent blockade that has isolated the territory for many years, a situation massively exacerbated by the current war. Hamas officials frequently point to the catastrophic humanitarian situation on the ground, a healthcare system that has all but collapsed, widespread and acute hunger bordering on famine, and a desperate lack of basic necessities. They also claim that the current U.S.-led proposal lacks the necessary strong guarantees for a return to a humanitarian protocol that, during previous brief truces, allowed for a more significant volume of aid to enter Gaza. The United States of America, in its role as a key mediator, has put forward a new plan aimed at breaking the deadlock. This proposal was reportedly presented by the U.S. envoy for the Middle East, Mr. Steve Witkoff. The American blueprint outlines a phased approach towards achieving a ceasefire and securing the release of hostages. According to various reports circulating in the media, the initial phase of this plan would see Hamas releasing 10 living Israeli hostages. Additionally, it is understood that this phase would involve Hamas handing over the remains of 18 hostages who have died. In return for these actions, the proposal suggests a 60-day ceasefire, during which Israel would release an as-yet unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners from its jails. This initiative represents Washington's latest diplomatic push. In response to this American proposal, Israeli officials, along with U.S. sources, have indicated that Israel has signed off on the plan, or at least agreed to its fundamental framework. It has been reported that Israel's Prime Minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, personally communicated this acceptance to the families of the Israeli hostages. These families have been enduring an agonizing wait for any positive news regarding their loved ones. However, it is important to note that Israel's agreement to the plan was given before Hamas had formally submitted its own detailed response, which included significant amendments and counter-demands. Essentially, Israel had given its provisional approval and was then in a position of waiting for Hamas's reaction to the terms it had already found acceptable. Despite this apparent endorsement of the U.S. framework, there has been a palpable sense of skepticism emanating from the Israeli leadership, including from Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. public statements have been made that cast doubt on Hamas's genuine willingness or even its capacity to release all the remaining hostages. Israel's declared objectives in this protracted and brutal conflict have consistently been twofold. Firstly, to secure the safe return of all its citizens who were taken captive, and secondly, to achieve its wider military aims within the Gaza Strip. These military aims prominently include the dismantling of Hamas's military infrastructure and its governing capabilities in the territory. These often competing objectives create complex political dynamics within Israel. When Hamas eventually delivered its formal response, complete with its proposed alterations and conditions, an unnamed Israeli official was swiftly quoted in the media describing these changes as constituting an effective rejection of the Witkoff proposal. This immediate and negative characterization from the Israeli side serves to underscore the substantial chasm that continues to separate the two principal parties to the conflict. Adding to the tense atmosphere, Israel's defense minister, Mr. Israel Katz, issued a particularly stark warning. He was reported as threatening annihilation if Hamas did not agree to the deal, largely as it had been presented by the United States and subsequently accepted by the Israeli government. Such strong rhetoric highlights the extreme fragility of the ongoing negotiation efforts. Hamas's unwavering insistence on securing a permanent ceasefire, as opposed to accepting another temporary truce, is rooted in a profound and pervasive distrust of Israeli intentions. This distrust is heavily informed by their interpretation of past events and experiences. The group's leadership fears that Israel would likely exploit any pause in the fighting primarily to reorganize and resupply its military forces. Following such a regrouping, Hamas anticipates that Israel would then resume its military offensive, potentially with even greater force and devastating consequences for Gaza. This specific concern is not merely abstract. Hamas leaders frequently cite the collapse of previous ceasefire agreements, such as the one that broke down in mid-March 2025, as evidence supporting their apprehension. Consequently, the amendments that Hamas has proposed to the U.S.-backed plan are, by their own admission, meticulously crafted. They are specifically designed with the aim of making it significantly more difficult for Israel to unilaterally restart large-scale hostilities, particularly if comprehensive talks aimed at finalizing a permanent ceasefire do not reach a successful conclusion by the end of the initial 60-day truce period. A senior Hamas official, Mr. Bassem Naim, has publicly stated that the U.S. proposal, in its original iteration, failed to adequately address core Palestinian demands. He particularly emphasized the lack of robust provisions for the complete lifting of the humanitarian blockade and for ensuring that aid can flow into Gaza freely, consistently, and in sufficient quantities to meet the desperate needs. Regarding the sensitive mechanics of the proposed hostage and prisoner exchange, Hamas has put forward its own distinct timeline and methodology. The group suggests that the release of Israeli captives should be a staggered process, unfolding gradually over the entire duration of the 60-day truce. This contrasts with the approach reportedly suggested in the U.S. plan, which envisaged the releases occurring in two more concentrated batches. Hamas's proposal also clarifies that this phased release would include not only living hostages, but also the remains of 18 hostages confirmed to have died in captivity. In return, Hamas expects the release of a significant, though still unspecified, number of Palestinian prisoners currently detained in Israeli jails. Before finalizing and submitting their formal response to the mediators, Hamas undertook a period of consultation with other Palestinian factions. Notably, these consultations included discussions with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement, another armed group active in Gaza. This step appears to be an effort to project a more unified Palestinian stance, at least among the key militant organizations involved in the conflict. Throughout this recent period of indirect talks, facilitated by officials from Qatar and Egypt, Hamas has maintained a cautious approach. They have engaged with the mediators while simultaneously making it clear that their core demands, a permanent end to the war, full Israeli withdrawal, and lifting the siege, are not issues on which they are prepared to make substantial compromises. The human cost of this latest phase of the conflict, which escalated dramatically following the collapse of a previous ceasefire agreement around mid-March 2025, is truly staggering and continues to mount daily. In the 10-week period from March 18, 2025 alone, the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza has reported that nearly 4,000 people have been killed. This shocking figure, when added to previous casualty counts, brings the total death toll in the Gaza Strip since the war originally erupted on October 7, 2023, to a devastating sum exceeding 54,200 individuals. These numbers, while difficult to independently verify in full, paint an undeniably grim and horrific picture of the sheer intensity and brutality of the ongoing Israeli military offensive. Beyond the appalling number of fatalities, the scale of human displacement within the Gaza Strip has reached almost unimaginable proportions. According to reports from United Nations agencies operating on the ground, Israeli military ground operations and the issuance of repeated evacuation orders since mid-March 2025 have forcibly displaced an estimated 600,000 additional people. It is crucial to understand that many of these individuals had already been uprooted multiple times previously during this conflict, constantly searching for safety in an ever-shrinking and increasingly perilous territory. The existing humanitarian infrastructure, already fragile before this latest escalation, is now completely overwhelmed and utterly unable to cope with such massive and continuous movements of desperate people fleeing the violence. The ominous threat of widespread famine now looms very large over Gaza's entire population, which numbers more than 2 million people. A recently published report, backed by the UN's Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, the global standard for assessing food crises, delivered a dire warning. It projected that approximately 500,000 people in Gaza are currently facing, or will face in the coming months, catastrophic levels of hunger, the most severe classification. The World Food Programme has also stated unequivocally that entire communities within Gaza are now starving. This is attributed primarily to severe restrictions imposed on the entry of humanitarian aid, although Israel did announce some easing of the blockade around May 2025 to allow basic food supplies to enter. Ultimately, the path to achieving a durable and meaningful peace agreement remains extraordinarily challenging. This is fundamentally due to the deeply entrenched and seemingly irreconcilable core positions of the two main warring parties. Israel continues to insist on the unconditional return of all its hostages and the complete disarmament of Hamas. It will not, it says, consider a permanent cessation of hostilities until these conditions are met, fearing that any lasting ceasefire would inadvertently allow Hamas to retain its political influence and, crucially, rebuild its military capabilities. Hamas, conversely, views a permanent ceasefire, a full Israeli withdrawal, and the lifting of the siege as absolutely essential for its own survival as an organization and for any realistic chance of alleviating the profound humanitarian catastrophe that has engulfed the Gaza Strip. The deep-seated mistrust, forged over decades of conflict, makes bridging this vast divide an immense and perhaps insurmountable task for international mediators.